both in the Psalms and in certain places in the New Testament, there is a promise that we shall enter into our rest. Sometimes it's called God's rest. These passages are often read at funerals, and this has sent a mixed message, which is that you'll basically get to rest when you're dead. That once you die, then you get to rest, right? And that's a weird message for any religion or spirituality to send, but it has especially taken on a strange tone within the last 100 years of working within a capitalist system where the 9 to 5 has sort of had its heyday and then fallen apart. And now we live in this gig economy for many. And for those of you who are retired, it might be especially confusing because you're busier now in retirement than you were before retirement. So on this Labor Day weekend, I want to talk about labor and rest just a little bit. And I want to ask you 2 questions at the end. It'll take me a while to get to the 2 questions, but I'll just tell you what they are up front. And then hopefully you'll see why I wanted to ask you them at the end. The questions are this. What do you do? What work do you do that you would consider sacred? Participating in the divine work, maybe is a better way to say it. What work do you do that you would consider sacred? That's going to be question 1. Question 2 is, when do you rest? Okay. Let me tell you why I'm thinking about that on this Labor Day weekend. When we have a weekend where we celebrate those who work, up until a couple years ago, that certainly meant one thing. But then during COVID quarantine, we created this new category of people called essential workers. And it has been fascinating to see how certain vocations have made their way into and then maybe out of that category of essential workers. Because at first, let's be honest, we meant our nurses and doctors and the people who got us our food, right? That was initially, that was sort of the broad category of essential workers, people we couldn't do without. And then as COVID quarantine went on, other people got added to that group, including bus drivers, right? To get us to and fro, and right, the categories grew. At one point, I was added, which shocked me. Because I'll be honest, if you've ever seen the quadrant of important and urgent, I think that what I do is important, but not urgent. So I got promoted to essential. And I thought, is what I do essential? I'm not sure that it is. But in order to have certain powers in the decision-making process, they added religious leaders and ministers to the essential category. And I thought, well, that's a very strange designation to go for me to go from celebrating those who we say, though, these are essential. And then for my vocation to get added to that broad category, I thought, I'm not sure this category is going to hold together very long. If it's like, Marx, I never wanted to be a part of a club that would accept me as a member, right? I wouldn't, any group that I'm put into as essential, I'm starting to think, oh no, is this a floating signifier? Because I'm not sure how long we can have a category called essential if I'm in it. That's how I felt. But this category of essential workers was an interesting thing. And then what I watched, which was fascinating, is how in the years before COVID quarantine, the open concept of houses was all the rage. When we would go to my wife's house, or the house she grew up in Montana, my in-laws' house, they have cable. My wife and I don't have cable. And they had this channel called Hgtv, right? And when we are there, it is on 24 hours a day because we have to watch these marathon shows to get caught up to speed in all this DIY, fixing up homes, flipping homes. And it's just like you're just inundated with this whole new vocabulary, right? And you get introduced to people like Chip and Joanna Gaines, right? Chip and JoJo. So I, being, playing the role I play in my family, I thought all of these shows start to sort of seem the same after a while. So I went online because I thought certainly somebody has made a game out of HGTV shows. And indeed, I was able to find an HGTV drinking bingo game. So I downloaded it and I printed it out and I ran upstairs and I said, guys, let's watch HGTV. And they said, what is that? Show us. So I gave everybody the bingo cards and they said, you cannot play this game. And I said, why? And they said, because you won't make it through 2 shows. With all of these buzzwords, like if I have to take a drink every time they say shiplap, open concept, gut job, like every buzzword, right? You'll never make it through 2 shows. So I was banned from playing. But even still to this day, when we're watching a show on YouTube or whatever, and somebody says shiplap or open concept or gut job, I just yell drink, just out of habit, just sheerly out of habit. But this idea of constantly the DIY, the work, the open concept became a problem because whereas pre-quarantine, it was nice to be able to be in the kitchen to see what people were watching, if they're watching a game in the living room and what your kids were doing, and everyone felt so connected. But then we started doing school at home and work at home, and everybody was on Zoom at the same time. And the open concept became a curse because you had no walls to divide up who was where and everyone could hear each other. My brother-in-law, works from home and he had 4 kids under 4 at the time. And both my sister and my brother-in-law constantly had at least one child on their lap during all work meetings. I don't know how they got through it, but they did. They're amazing. But this concept of the open home concept became a real problem because as people were working from home, it totally changed the dynamic. So then you follow that through a year, and all of a sudden people started having a level of fatigue and burnout because they were never not at work. This really caught my attention because 2 summers ago for our summer book group, we read a book called Bowling Alone. And in that book, Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam introduced to me the idea of a third space. So if work is your first space and home is your second space, we need a third space to go between work and home. How many of you remember the show Cheers back on NBC Must Watch? Yeah, Must See TV, where everybody knows your name, right? Norm would walk in, the whole bar would yell, Norm, right? That's a third space, right? For some people, it was the gym. For some people, it was the coffee shop. In fact, some coffee shops actually named themselves the third space, right? But in COVID, that whole paradigm fell apart because a lot of us weren't at our first space. We didn't go to work anymore. That meant that our second space became our first space. So we had no separation. And then we weren't allowed to go to our third space. And so the entire thing sort of dissolved. And then people started really getting depressed and discouraged and frustrated and worn out, right? And burned out because the whole way we had structured our life with this separation of work and home and maybe a third space, which is what Bowling Alone was about, was the demise of the third space. The whole thing sort of melted together like a box of crayons that had been left on the dashboard. It became just one congealed mess. And so the question became like, when am I not at work? And it became really problematic for people. So if you're got your kids, maybe you're on Zoom, you're working on Zoom, maybe you're a student yourself and you're doing that, everything became one thing. And it became a real problem. So when it comes to Labor Day now, there's a new set of questions for us that are different than they were even 5 years ago. So I want to ask you these two questions. What work do you do that you would consider divine? Now, some of you don't like this question very much because maybe you're at a job where you think there's not a single thing I do. I don't know. I don't know how to answer this question. And now I'm agitated. Thanks, Pastor Bo. I don't want to go back to work. But listen, what if we were to say all work, in some sense, is divine in that God has provided it, God has gifted you, God has called you? There has to be something, some element of what you do. It may not be what's actually on your job description, but there has to be something, whether it's connecting with your coworkers or your neighbors or, right? Providing. But in a capitalist system, post-industrial revolution, if there's nothing that you do that you would say this work has an element of the sacred to it, I think that's an interesting answer. For those of you who are retired and your schedule is filled up with really good things, this might be a good time to ask yourself, what is it exactly that I do during the week that is a part of the divine work in the world? Because otherwise, if we're just filling up our time with things and tasks and errands and busyness, we're missing out on a divine opportunity to work and to partner with God in what God is doing in the world. So I just wanted to set that question in front of you. Even if it's an unsatisfying question at this point, I want you to have some holy agitation about it. That's a fancy preacher word. Some holy agitation about it. Like a rock in your sandal. I want it to bug you. Because work is to be a blessing. That when you are operating in that area where you are called or gifted to provide, that there's supposed to be a connection to your religious life, so that what we do here is not entirely different than what you do out there. That the two have the possibility of dovetailing and actually mutually informing and encouraging each other. Just an idea. And if that's not true for you, I set this question in front of you and say, it's okay to not like this question right now. Second question is, so when do you rest? Again, during the last 2.5 years, the epidemic of sleeplessness, right, and insomnia and agitation and depression has become a central issue to many people in the past 2.5 years. Life has gotten much tougher for many of us. So in this idea of rest, you know, it used to be that there was one day of the week called the Sabbath or the Lord's Day, when nothing else wasn't, no soccer practice, stores weren't open, right? It was set aside as it, and now all 7 days look basically absolutely identical. They're all the same and they run together. So when do we rest? I think that these two priorities, to participate in the divine work in the world and to know that there is rest in God, are two gifts that I just wanted to put in front of you on this Labor Day weekend. And you may not like your current answer, so I'm going to give you a challenge. Not an assignment, because I'm not a teacher, but a challenge, which is to say, if you don't like your answer to these two questions today, could I ask you to take a moment and think about how things might be different by next Labor Day? How might things be different a year from now? What could you invest your time, talent, and treasure in? What could you hand off to someone else that they could do 80% as well as you can? No one can do it as well as you can. But what if they could do it 80% as well as you can? What could you hand off? What do you need to say no to free up space so you can say yes to what your heart desires? When do you rest? Because it would be very tragic to me if people of faith allowed this world's system of profit and gain and their definition of labor to set the agenda for us, and then for us to miss the opportunity that working in the world for good and being people who participate in rest so that we can be the healthiest versions of ourselves, if we missed that opportunity that is a part of our own religious tradition, then we have allowed this world's system to give us a liturgy of life that wears us down and burns us out. And that is not God's plan for us as a people. I'm going to invite you to turn to your neighbor real quick, and I want you to tell them something you heard that you liked and something you heard that you didn't like. Okay?